Good morning, and welcome to our Zoom worship service. We begin our service by acknowledging that the land on which our homes and our church were built was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For those of us who live in Moscow, Pullman, or other nearby communities, we live on the ancestral homelands of the Nimipu, called Nez Perce by the French-speaking traders, the Palouse, and the Shitshumsh, called the Coeur d'Alene. If you're joining us from another place, I encourage you to discover who inhabited or moved through the place where you now live in times before colonization and genocide. We take this opportunity to pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, on ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and for responsible stewardship. May our remembering help us find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all her peoples. And now let's join our voices together for our words of welcome, our unison chalice lighting, and our sung affirmation. So please say these words with me. Whoever you are, wherever you've come from, whatever your beliefs, whomever you love, and however bumpy your life's journey, know that you are welcome here. We're hoping that everyone has a chalice or a candle to light and something to light it with. Let's light our flames together.
Hello, I'm Ginger Yoder, and I am going to light our chalice this morning. In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek and seek to share.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and love arise. Let beauty, truth, and good be sung in every land by every tongue.
So just a few months ago, on December 7th, the start of Hanukkah, the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise was defaced by swastika stickers that read, "We are everywhere." Then in February, someone defaced Temple Beth Shalom in Spokane, as well as its Holocaust memorial. The man who committed the crime has since been arrested, but these two acts of domestic terrorism, these two hate crimes, one to the north and one to the south, are clearly something that we need to pay attention to. Now, in response to what happened in Boise in December, many of us purchased lawn signs from the Wasmuth Center for Human Rights that read, "Love is everywhere, justice is everywhere, respect is everywhere, equality is everywhere, kindness is everywhere, compassion is everywhere, we are everywhere." It felt like enough, at least initially. The signs popped up all over town, but then we got news about what happened in Spokane, and that, for me at least, upped the ante. So at the next meeting of the Interfaith Association, when Joanne Juanita invited us to consider a coordinated response, as a group, we agreed both to send a letter expressing solidarity and support to the temple and to each in our own context lift up anti-Semitism and hate crimes in a preach-in, teach-in. Now, I'll be honest with you, preparing today's service wasn't easy. Reading through things like the Southern Poverty Law Center's report on hate crimes, it broke my heart. And to do it in a week where we were witnessing the unprovoked murders of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo made it even harder. But I think facing the brutal realities of white supremacy, while it breaks my heart, it also makes me really angry. That good kind of anger that energizes and infuses me with courage. So buckle up, friends. We're going to face some difficult truths together about the tactics that white supremacy is using in this so-called culture war. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it's going to take to disarm them. But let's begin by singing Hine Matov. The words are on your screen.
Hinema tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hinema tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hinema tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hinema tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hinema tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together. Good and pleasant, people in peace together. Good and pleasant, people in peace together. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together. Hinema tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hinema tovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together. Good and pleasant, people in peace together. Good and pleasant, people in peace together. How good it is and how pleasant for people to dwell together.
Our meditation today, we'll enter into a time of meditation today with words by my colleague Laura Bogle, Inside, Outside. Outside, the flags fly down the highway, hanging onto the back of large trucks or the chest of a man. Outside, there's grabbing and taking, a staking and restaking of territory claimed. The roads cut, the oil burned, blockades erected, and walls built. Outside, the borders between us are made visible in noise, colors, ballots, signs, and signals. Inside resides the breath of common ancestors, the child who plays with no thought of malice, the heart tuned towards suffering, the taste of figs ripening in the lingering autumn heat, the sliver of an orange moon low in the evening November sky. Inside begins something you might call a prayer. Let us kneel down not to God or nation or ideology, but to what is inside. A feeling, a connection, a welling at the very beginning of time, unpolluted and gently flowing, sweet and dark and healing. Let us kneel down to the persistent possibility that the life and love within prevail. Let us release what is inside, outward, in beauty, spilling toward each other until all merges. Unstoppable well of knowing that we will only ever be saved by one another. In the silence, let us let that possibility rise inside our hearts and souls. I have two readings this morning. The first comes from a curriculum created by the Anti-Defamation League. Racism often involves a clear power dynamic in which a privileged group believes itself to be naturally superior and attempts to retain its social advantages by persecuting or discriminating against other racialized groups. While most forms of racism focus on emphasizing the perceived weaknesses of another group, anti-Semites tend to portray Jews as both too strong and too weak, as well as the cause of all social problems. The list of paradoxes is long. Jews have been blamed by racists for promoting racial equality and by racial minorities for promoting slavery and racism. Jews have been blamed by capitalists for preaching socialism and by socialists for alleged capitalist exploitation. Jews have been targeted by social conservatives for empowering sexual minorities and by queer activists for patriarchal conservatism. And the list goes on. Like non-Jews, Jews constitute a diverse population that does not act monolithically. However, the particular conditions of Jewish history, interpreted through anti-Semitic ideology, have contributed to perceptions of Jews as nefarious actors and manipulative magicians, always to blame. Thus, unlike other kinds of prejudice, anti-Semitism is a paranoid mentality that intertwines an imagined Jewish essence in relationship with other ideological concerns, prejudices, or aims. Ultimately, it rests on applying simple, false explanations to complex social problems. Across eras and cultures, these ideas about Jews have been used to justify exclusion, discrimination, violence, and genocide. The second reading comes from the Year in Hate and Extremism, 2020. Historically, Southern Poverty Law Center research shows that when extremists perceive more allies in the halls of power, their numbers dip. Not so with the Trump presidency. For the first 3 years of his presidency, SPLC recorded historically high hate group numbers as bigotry found a comfortable home in the White House. And white nationalist ideologues influenced policies like the Muslim ban and separation of immigrant children from families at the border. Hate groups that traditionally occupy the mainstream, like anti-LGBTQ groups and anti-immigrant groups, saw their influence in government balloon over the last 4 years, with serious consequences for human rights in America and around the world. Nativist bigotry brought about one of the worst human rights crises in modern US history when the Department of Homeland Security separated children from their parents at the southern border. The administration also effectively suspended the legal asylum process, stranding people who fled violence in their home countries, and vacated asylum protections for survivors of intimate partner violence. Anti-LGBTQ appointments to the judiciary will likely threaten trans and queer American civil rights for a generation. So part of my process when I'm working on a service is that I go back through services that I've done on similar or related topics, mostly because I don't want to be too repetitive and do the same thing over and over or tell the same story over and over. So it was interesting to me that when I did that this week, when I've preached on white supremacism, racism, or racial justice, most often Jim Waddell was my celebrant. We did these services together a lot because, of course, I think of all the conversations that he and I had about this, from the story about that moment of waking up when he realized that a Black acquaintance couldn't go bowling, to the story he told me that he shared about the beating he got while protesting at Columbia in 1968. So my hope is that this service will help us all be thoughtful and brave and a little bit fiery. And I dedicate it to my friend Jim. So here's the deal. We live in a nation built on white supremacy. Our nation is built on the violent conquest and genocide of Indigenous people, on the unimaginably horrible abuse and exploitation of Black people through slavery and then Jim Crow, and now mass incarceration and police violence. Built on the exoticization and exploitation of Asian immigrants, including concentration camps during World War II. Built on the discrimination and exploitation of Latinx migrant workers. And those detention centers on the border, let's just call them what they are. They are also concentration camps. Now, in and amongst these tangled, toxic roots, there are seeds of something better. There are these ideals. All people are created equal. All people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those seeds have taken root. We see them growing and blooming with women's suffrage and feminism, with the emancipation and the civil rights movement. In the Indigenous Renaissance, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a move to give the national parks back to the tribes as reparations, which I think is just the coolest and best idea ever. I don't know if we can generate the political will or help to generate the political will, but if we can, it seems like a really good place to start. We're seeing this rising awareness of AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander hate, and that community is really coming together and starting to stand up for themselves, even here on the Palouse. We have labor unions, we have DACA and the Dreamers, so people have come together to mobilize against the sins of white supremacy that, and for this vision of a better world, a better nation. So I have this sense when I step back that evolution is happening, change is happening, that human rights are increasing over time, that racial justice gets closer, that we're ever moving just a little bit nearer to that dream of beloved community. Now, I think we need to resist the pull to American exceptionalism. So we have to be plain. There are other nations that are way ahead of this one, and there are some that are behind. But the comparison is kind of useless or pointless. The important thing is that we have to keep moving. So this is where we are. This is where we are. We need to uproot hate and oppression in ourselves and in the world, and we need to plant seeds of love and justice and compassion and kindness. Now, as those of us who are gardeners know all too well, weeds are tenacious, and a lot of them have thorns. Weeds are the ideologies that are toxic and grow from white supremacy, seeds of white supremacy, are things like the idea that some ways of being human are inherently better than others, or the idea that human rights are like a pie and that creating justice for those who've been oppressed or marginalized somehow diminishes or takes away from those who are privileged, which is just ludicrous. Ideas like the scarcity mindset, which exists not just about rights, but resources, the sense that there's not enough for everyone. In other words, the real seeds are dehumanization, the ability to see people not as people, but as things, as other, and greed. These weeds are lies. They need to be cleared out to make space for deep spiritual truths that we as Unitarian Universalists know and celebrate. All people are inherently worthy and deserve safety and kindness and dignity. Rights for some do not diminish rights for others. If people would stop hoarding, there would be enough for everyone. In other words, we plant the seeds of the sacredness of every human and all of life. And we plant the seeds of embracing interdependence. It's gardening season out in the world, but when it comes to this work, it's always gardening season. And gardening is hard work. Real gardening is hard work, and this work of uprooting the weeds and planting the seeds of love and compassion is hard work. So we need to be clear about why we're doing it. What we're trying to do is make space for every human being to grow and flourish in the fullness of who they are. Now, at the national level, we've just survived 4 years of leadership that provided the weeds with plenty of extra fertilizer. These 4 years ended in the insurrection on January 6th. And President Biden and Vice President Harris are doing their best to get things back in order, but it is slow going. The Poverty Law Center reports that even though 65% of Americans believe that racism exists and is harmful, 49% believe that people of color are more likely to be poor because of a lack of work ethic. 51% believe that the looting that occurred during Black Lives Matter demonstrations was a bigger problem than police violence against Black people. 51% believe that Black Lives Matter protests were not justified because the problem with police violence is isolated to a few bad apples. Now, racism should not be a political issue any more than wearing masks or condemning a violent attempt to disrupt the democratic process should be political issues. Yet somehow that's what racism has become. And apparently most Republican politicians believe that pandering to white supremacists is necessary to retain power. So they're holding their noses and abandoning their integrity. Now we might say not all Republicans, but I have yet to see many Republicans willing to take a principled stand against hate and overt racism. Apparently, they're too afraid of alienating the base. So I think at some point you have to ask yourselves, at what point does silence become complicity? At what point does silence become complicity? So President Biden and Vice President Harris are going to do the best they can, but they're fighting an uphill battle. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the election in Idaho and other red states, we're seeing the pursuit of an aggressive anti-human rights agenda. And with apologies to those of you who live in Washington state, I want to touch on just a few of the horrible things that have happened in red states so far this year. We've seen anti-trans legislation. We've seen voter suppression and other bald attempts to hold on to power, such as here in Idaho, that changed the initiative process, or the block on local safety ordinances, or the limits on the governor's emergency power. Most sinister, we've seen a move to defund education, and in particular, an effort to cut funding to colleges and schools that offer continuing ed credit in critical race theory or anything related to social justice. There is no other way to understand this than as a defense of white supremacy. One of the things that we know is that attitudes toward human rights are evolving over time. It's a generational issue. And that's because educators are learning and teaching truth. They're learning and teaching history from all people's perspectives, not just the perspective of the dead white men who justified their inhumane acts and unjust choices by dehumanizing anyone who didn't look like them. What happens when we hear these stories, when we hear these truths, is that our natural human instinct toward empathy and compassion is engaged. That process is what what's-her-name out of Whitebird is trying to stop. So it's like they're actively attacking beautiful and important plants, defending the weeds, and then also creating an artificial drought where water equals money by doing completely nonsensical things like refusing federal funds for early childhood education. So it's a pretty blighted landscape. And in this blighted landscape, where does anti-Semitism fit in? Well, first let's start by just touching on what anti-Semitism is. It includes Holocaust denial, the propagation of a number of toxic myths that Jews are Jesus killers, have too much power, that they're disloyal or greedy, that they use Christian blood for religious rituals. And then, of course, a whole raft of hate crimes. The Anti-Defamation League reports that the most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States recorded more than 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, and harassment, an increase of 12% over the previous year. This is the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents since tracking began in 1979. Let me say that again. Last year had the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents since 1979. The year included 5 fatalities directly linked to anti-Semitic violence and another 91 individuals targeted in physical assaults. Assault, harassment, and vandalism against Jews remain at near historic levels in the United States. The deadly attacks in synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway have made American Jews feel more vulnerable than they have felt in decades. End of quote. Now, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, there's a particularly delicate issue around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I found a resource that gave some guidelines that how progressives can talk about that conflict in ways that are not anti-Semitic. So what the guidelines say, clear criticisms of Israeli policy are appropriate. But we have to be careful because activists often will slip a little and repeat anti-Semitic ideas. So you have sort of, if you think of it as sort of a spectrum from being clear and appropriate to being actively anti-Semitic, sometimes progressive activists wind up sliding toward the middle a little bit. It's okay to say things like, Israel has a repeated and ongoing record of human rights offenses, but it is not okay to say Israel is a worse human rights violator than most or all other countries. It's okay to say that the Zionist movement has included elements of racism, or that Zionism as a whole has had racist and oppressive results for the Palestinian people. But it's not okay to say that Zionism is racism. This resource is called Past Didn't Go Anywhere, Making Resistance to Anti-Semitism Part of All of Our Movements. And there was this little passage that I found very helpful and wanted to share with you. I quote, "Many oppressions rely on keeping a targeted group of people poor, uneducated, designated non-white, or otherwise at the bottom. Anti-Jewish oppression doesn't depend on that. Although at many times it has kept Jews in poverty or designated non-white, these have been optional features because the point of anti-Jewish oppression is to keep a Jewish face in front so that Jews, instead of ruling classes, become the target for people's rage. It works even more smoothly when Jews are allowed some success and can be perceived as the ones in charge by other oppressed groups." So former President Trump tweeted an image of Hillary Clinton's face atop a pile of cash next to the Star of David and the phrase, "most corrupt candidate ever." He released an ad featuring the faces of powerful Jewish people with a voiceover about them being part of a global power structure that has robbed our working class and stripped our country of its wealth. So this uptake in anti-Semitism is because former President Trump and his ilk are trying to make the Jews scapegoats. It's not the unbridled capitalists who are responsible for the erosion of rural America's standard of living. It's the Jews. That's what's happening. So take a deep breath. I found I had to medicate with leftover Easter candy at this point of my research. So, what are we to do? What is it for us to do? The Southern Poverty Law Center says that our priorities should be to support our Congress in enacting the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would establish offices with the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the FBI to monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. To improve federal hate crime data collection, training, and prevention, because data drives policy. And while the FBI keeps a hate crime statistics report, it's inaccurate because law enforcement agencies aren't required to report hate crimes, so most of them don't. Big surprise there. We should encourage our Congress to enact the Khalil Gibran and Heather Heyer National Opposition to Hate, Assault, and Threats to Equality Act of 2019, the No Hate Act. And we should support our Congress in shifting funding away from punishment models toward prevention. So steer young people away from dangerous ideas. The Law Center believes this work is better housed in the Department of Education than Homeland Security, which of course is the exact opposite of what's happening here in Idaho. The Southern Poverty Law Center also encourages us to oppose efforts to create a new criminal domestic terrorism statute because they believe it will adversely impact civil liberties and could be used to expand racial profiling or target communities of color and political opponents. Eric Degan on National Public Radio offers these 4 tips. Accept that we've all been raised in a society that elevates white culture over others. And being anti-racist means first challenging those notions inside ourselves. He says, learn the history of racism and anti-racism, especially in America, and educate ourselves about the complexities of the issues we're confronting. He tells us to seek out films and TV shows and novels and articles which challenge our notions of race and culture and dive in deeply so that we can learn to see anti-racism in new ways. And then he encourages us to find local organizations involved in anti-racism efforts, preferably led by people of color, and help uplift their voices and ideas. There's more. There's so much more. You got some spare time, go to your computer and Google how to be an anti-racist. The resources come up all over the place. For us living where we are, whether we're in Moscow or Pullman or the surrounding area, this is my advice or my thoughts on what it is for us to do. I think it's important that we refrain from thinking in red or blue and remember that our communities are various shades of purple. I think we should be choosing to be effective rather than trying to be right, or even worse, righteous. Change happens in relationships, so we need to listen and feel around fertile ground. There's got to be some integrity out there somewhere if we can make space for it to wake up. We can plant seeds, speak from our own deeply held values about the inherent worth and dignity of all people, about the importance of compassion and equity in human relations, about interdependence and how we need to lean into interdependence in this new age. We can be like pollinators, lifting up all of the good work being done. We make choices about what we share on social media, what we send to our friends and families. We can lift up good work, good thought, anti-racist writings and opportunities. And we can keep weeding in our own hearts. We've been steeped in white supremacy culture our entire lives. And we may not know that in there somewhere is a belief or perspective or action that could be experienced by others as harmful or racist. Sometimes you can't tell the weeds from the real plants, from the plants that you want to grow. So there's a discipline around welcoming calls to accountability. When somebody tells us that we've made a mistake, to welcome that as a great and generous gift, and not to go to a place of shame and defensiveness, but rather to embrace the learning. And then we just water health wherever we find it. Above all, I think it's important that we not lose hope. May Sarton once wrote, "Help us to be ever faithful gardeners of the Spirit, who know that without darkness, nothing ever comes to birth, and without light, nothing flowers." So let's stick together and face into the discomfort, even if it takes a little chocolate to get through. Let's do the work where we are, in our hearts, in our homes, in our families, in our communities, and keep doing it, coming back to it again and again, until the whole world becomes a garden where everyone in safety and in beauty. Everyone, no exceptions. So be it, and so may it be. Let's sing together our closing hymn, Shalom Haverim.
Shalom Haverim, Shalom Haverim, Shalom, Shalom. Lehitraot, Lehitraot, Shalom, Shalom. Shalom Haverim, Shalom Haverim, Shalom Haverim. shalom, haverim shalom, haverim shalom, lehitraot, lehitraot, shalom, shalom.
Our closing words come from a piece by my colleague, the Reverend Gretchen Haley. We have, after all, misunderstood creation and our place in it. We've misunderstood what it means to be human, and we have misplaced our ultimate loyalty. We do not have a political problem. We do not need an organizing strategy. We have a spiritual crisis. And it is the same crisis that creates the culture of death and violence and self-interest and short-sightedness that keeps us all grieving and teetering between despair and overwhelm, longing for and practicing escape. It is the same crisis that is killing unarmed children of color, and it is the same crisis that led to far too many preventable deaths this year from COVID. We do not have an environmental crisis, plus a racial justice crisis, plus a gun crisis. It's all the same thing, a spiritual crisis. And so we need spiritual tools and practices. We need new rituals and prayers and songs and stories that tell us who we really are, who we belong to, what matters most of all. And we need to be rigorous in our practices, maybe even more than anything new. We need the old rituals, prayers, songs, and stories all reconstituted in service of the world that is trying to be born. We need to remember the ancient future world, the world reborn, the born again life baptized in our new old covenant with all of creation. All of creation, no exceptions. And now let's sing together our sung benediction, There is a Love. Please say with me the words to embody the flame. We extinguish this chalice that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light our paths as we leave this place. May it guide our way until we are together again. It seems kind of simplistic sometimes to say that love is the answer, but that's what I keep coming back to over and over again. That love is the answer. Love is the path forward. Love of earth, love of each other, love of our fellow human beings, no matter how trapped they are by the lies they were taught by their hunger for power or greed. Just pour love out, because there's an inexhaustible fount of it in us, beyond us, holding us. Don't be afraid. Don't be stingy. Love more, love harder. Just keep loving. We'll find our way. We'll find our way.